The train ride to Chicago was long, but not long enough to ease the tension tightening in my chest. The weight of the ledger pressed against my coat, a constant reminder that Wilkes had died for the secrets within its pages. Secrets we were now carrying straight into the lion's den. Elizabeth sat beside me in silence, staring out at the city skyline as it loomed in the distance, half shrouded in mist. She hadn't spoken much since we left the Midnight Express behind. I didn't blame her. We had barely made it out alive, and now, instead of escaping, we were walking straight toward more danger. I was Eleanor Clare, a private investigator with more experience digging through high-stakes corruption than I'd care to admit. Hired under mysterious circumstances, I had initially thought my job was simply to watch over a man named Wilkes. Instead, I ended up holding the key to one of the most dangerous conspiracies I'd ever encountered. "Tell me again why we're doing this," I said, breaking the silence. Elizabeth sighed and turned to face me. "Because whatever's inside that safe deposit box is the final piece. Wilkes wouldn't have risked everything for just the ledger. He must have had something bigger, something so damning that even the people in power were afraid of it." Elizabeth Ward wasn't just another bystander. A former insider within the financial elite, she had once worked with Wilkes in transactions that were now proving to be lethal. She claimed she wanted out of that world, but I wasn't convinced. She knew too much, and knowing too much was a death sentence in this game. I exhaled, rubbing my temples. "And you're sure this bank is still holding it?" "They wouldn't dare destroy it," she said firmly. "Not yet. Not until they know for sure no one else has access." Wilkes was careful. "He left instructions, and we have the key. That's our advantage." I wasn't convinced. If someone was willing to kill to keep this conspiracy buried, they wouldn't hesitate to wipe out loose ends. And we were the biggest loose ends of all. The train pulled into Union Station, the steam hissing as passengers shuffled to collect their belongings. The moment we stepped onto the platform, I felt it, that unmistakable sense of being watched. Elizabeth felt it too. She glanced around, her movements tense. "We need to move fast," she murmured. "Blend in." I nodded and adjusted my hat, keeping my expression neutral as we pushed through the bustling crowd. Chicago was alive with movement. Men in crisp suits heading to business meetings, women clutching shopping bags as they navigated the busy streets. It should have felt normal. But nothing about this felt normal. Our destination was the Union Trust Bank, a towering building in the heart of the financial district. Wilkes had hidden something there, something that was important enough to die for. The key in my pocket felt like it was burning a hole straight through the fabric. As we approached the entrance, a figure in a dark overcoat and hat leaned against a lamppost across the street. He wasn't looking at us, not directly, but I could feel his attention locked onto us. "We're being followed," I muttered under my breath. Elizabeth didn't react right away. She simply adjusted her gloves, stepping slightly closer to me as she whispered, "Inside. Now." We slipped through the heavy glass doors of the bank, the warmth inside contrasting with the sharp cold air of the streets. The lobby was grand, marble floors gleaming under the chandelier's glow. A uniformed clerk greeted us with a polite nod from behind a polished counter. I forced a smile and stepped forward. "We're here to access a safe deposit box." The clerk gave me a once-over before sliding a form across the counter. "Key and identification, please." I pulled out the key, keeping a firm grip on it as I placed it on the counter. Elizabeth handed over the forged documents we had prepared in advance. The clerk studied them for a moment, then gave a tight smile. One moment. He disappeared into a back office, and I felt Elizabeth shift beside me. "This is taking too long," she murmured. I nodded, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. My instincts screamed at me to move, to leave, but we were already in too deep. The clerk returned, but he wasn't alone. A bank manager, an older man with sharp eyes and a carefully measured expression, walked beside him. "I'm sorry," the manager said, his voice smooth but firm. "There's been a hold placed on this deposit box." Elizabeth's fingers twitched at her side. "What kind of hold?" He didn't blink. "A security flag. You'll need to speak with our head of security before accessing it." I could feel my stomach sinking. We weren't the only ones looking for this box. Before I could respond, the doors behind us opened, and heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floor. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see the two men entering, one of them the same figure from outside. They weren't here to make a deposit. Elizabeth barely breathed the words, but I heard them clear as day. "Run." Instinct took over before I could think twice. I grabbed Elizabeth's wrist and yanked her away from the counter just as the two men stepped further inside. My pulse quickened as I caught a glimpse of their demeanor, controlled, efficient, and utterly deadly. They weren't here to talk. "Through there," Elizabeth hissed, nodding toward a hallway that disappeared behind the bank's reception desk. Without hesitation, I pulled her along, weaving between startled patrons and heading straight for the staff-only section. "Stop them." The bank manager's voice echoed through the marble halls, but I had already pushed through the side door, slamming it behind me. We bolted down the hallway, past filing rooms and closed offices, until we reached a locked steel door. Elizabeth cursed under her breath. "This leads to the service exit. We need to find another way." I scanned the narrow corridor. The walls were lined with framed photographs of past bank directors. Decades of corruption, no doubt. My heart pounded as I heard hurried footsteps behind us. They were close. Then I saw it, a narrow maintenance stairwell just a few feet ahead. "There," I whispered, yanking the door open. The air smelled of dust and old metal, and the steep staircase wound downward into darkness. It was our best shot. We descended quickly, our shoes clanking against the steps. The sounds of pursuit followed, boots striking the marble floor above us. They were coming. At the bottom of the stairs, another door awaited. I pushed it open and found myself in the bank's underground archives, a maze of towering shelves, filled with records spanning decades. Rows upon rows of storage boxes loomed over us, the dim lighting casting eerie shadows. Elizabeth caught her breath, eyes scanning the labyrinth before us. "We can lose them in here," she whispered. I nodded. The footsteps above had reached the stairwell. We had seconds, maybe less. Splitting up wasn't an option, not when we had no idea how many were after us. I motioned for Elizabeth to follow and darted between the shelves, keeping low, weaving through the maze of financial history. Somewhere behind us, the stairwell door creaked open. Heavy footfalls echoed in the confined space. They were inside. I pressed my back against a row of shelves, holding my breath as I watched a shadow move between the towering records. Elizabeth was crouched beside me, her fingers curled into fists. A voice, low and measured, cut through the silence. "Miss Clare, Miss Ward, you can't hide forever." I recognized that voice. Thomas Gray. I'd crossed paths with him before, back when I was working a case that involved high-profile fraud in New York. He was a professional, a fixer for powerful men who wanted their problems handled quietly. And now, we were his problem. Elizabeth's gaze flicked to me. She knew him too. "We need a distraction," she mouthed silently. I glanced at the shelves stacked with heavy ledgers and records, an idea forming. Slowly, carefully, I reached out and tipped one of the metal storage racks just enough to shift its balance. The shelf groaned. A moment later, it crashed sideways, slamming into the one beside it in a domino effect of cascading shelves and flying paper. A deafening roar filled the archive room as thousands of documents rained down in an avalanche of chaos. Go! I grabbed Elizabeth and sprinted toward the far end of the room while Gray and his men scrambled to avoid the falling shelves. Papers and broken wood littered the floor as we ran, weaving past the wreckage. A door loomed ahead, a rusted emergency exit. I prayed it wasn't locked as I slammed into it shoulder first. It gave way. Cold air hit me like a slap as we stumbled into a dark alleyway behind the bank. The scent of rain lingered in the air, the distant hum of city traffic grounding me back into reality. Elizabeth straightened, glancing behind us. They'll recover fast. We need to disappear. I nodded, already moving. We need a place to regroup. She hesitated, then exhaled. I might know someone. I didn't have time to ask who before she grabbed my hand and pulled me into the city streets, merging with the bustling crowd. We weren't safe. Not yet. But we had made it out alive, for now. The city swallowed us whole. The towering buildings of Chicago's financial district loomed overhead, their glass windows reflecting the gray sky above. Steam curled up from the gutters, and the streets buzzed with movement. Businessmen hailing cabs, newspaper vendors shouting headlines, and the occasional police officer giving us nothing more than a passing glance. Elizabeth led the way, her steps quick but calculated, threading through the crowd with the ease of someone who had spent years knowing when to disappear. I followed, forcing myself to appear casual while every nerve in my body screamed to look over my shoulder. We can't just keep running, I murmured under my breath as we rounded a corner onto a quieter street. We're not, Elizabeth replied. We need to regroup. I know someone who might be able to help. She stopped abruptly outside an old brick building, its faded signage suggesting it had once been a tailor's shop. The windows were covered with thick curtains, and the paint on the door was peeling from years of neglect. This is your contact? I asked, skeptical. Elizabeth ignored my tone and knocked twice. Sharp, deliberate. A pause. Then a single knock came from the other side before the door creaked open just enough to reveal a sliver of a face. A pair of dark eyes peered out at us, cautious but not surprised. Who's she? The voice behind the door asked, gravelly and untrusting. She's with me, Elizabeth said firmly. We need a place to talk. A moment of hesitation. Then the door swung open just enough for us to slip inside before it closed behind us with a heavy thud. The interior was dimly lit, the scent of tobacco and old paper filling the air. Stacks of files and newspapers cluttered a wooden desk, and a radio crackled softly in the background. The man standing before us was older, mid-50s perhaps, with a neatly trimmed beard and a wary expression. He wore a vest over a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. This was a man who had seen his fair share of trouble and had survived it. Eleanor Clare, I introduced myself, watching him carefully. He nodded but didn't offer his own name right away. Instead, he turned to Elizabeth. This better not bring trouble to my doorstep. It already has, she admitted. But I didn't have another choice. The man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You always have a choice, Ward. I folded my arms. And you are. He eyed me for a long moment before answering. Calvin Rourke. Used to be with the Bureau a long time ago. That explained the way he carried himself, like a man used to handling danger. I need to know what you're up against before I decide whether I'm helping you, he said, motioning toward 2 chairs by the desk. So, start talking. Elizabeth and I sat, and for the next 10 minutes, I laid everything out. The ledger, Wilkes' death, the safe deposit box, and the men who were now hunting us. I kept my voice even, watching Rourke's reaction closely. He was good at hiding his thoughts, but I caught the slight tightening of his jaw when I mentioned Thomas Gray. "You know him," I said. Rourke didn't deny it. "Gray's been cleaning up messes for powerful people for years. If he's after you, you're sitting on something big." "The safe deposit box," Elizabeth said. "It has to be more than just financial records. Wilkes had an insurance policy." Something damning. Rourke ran a hand over his beard, thinking, "Getting to that box won't be easy. If Gray's involved, you can bet he's already tightened security at the bank." I nodded. "Then we need a way in that doesn't get us both killed." Rourke studied me for a long moment before sighing. "I might have a way. But it'll cost you." Elizabeth leaned forward. "What do you want?" Rourke's gaze flicked to her, then back to me. "I need leverage against Gray's employers. You get me something I can use, and I'll get you inside that bank." I exhaled slowly. A dangerous trade, but we didn't have a choice. "Then we better get to work," I said. Calvin Rourke leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden desk. The dim light cast long shadows over his face, making it difficult to read his expression. I knew men like him, calculated, always playing an angle. The problem was, I needed his angle to align with mine. Elizabeth shifted beside me, her fingers tight around the armrest of her chair. "We don't have much time, Rourke. Gray isn't the type to wait." Rourke let out a slow breath, nodding. "All right. You need into that safe deposit box, and I need something on Gray's employers. The best way in. A distraction." I arched an eyebrow. "What kind of distraction?" "A federal investigation," Rourke said, his tone flat. "A fake one, to be exact." Elizabeth scoffed. "You want us to fake a federal raid?" Rourke nodded. "It'll force Gray's people to scatter. They won't be able to cover all their bases at once, and that gives you a window to get inside the bank undetected." I exchanged a glance with Elizabeth. It was insane. Reckless. And our best shot. "How do we pull that off?" I asked, leaning forward. Rourke smirked. "I've got a guy who can forge credentials, badges, paperwork, the works. You two will go in as federal agents investigating financial misconduct. I'll plant a call to Gray's men, make them think the heat's real." Elizabeth still looked unconvinced. "And what happens when they find out the raid isn't real?" Rourke shrugged. "That's your problem. By then, you'll already have what you need." I exhaled, weighing our limited options. This was risky, but Rourke was right. If Gray thought federal agents were onto him, his men would scatter, even if only temporarily. And temporary was all we needed. "All right," I said. "Let's do it." Rourke grinned and stood, reaching for his coat. "Then we'd better move. If we're going to make this believable, we have a lot of work to do." Elizabeth and I exchanged one last look. There was no turning back now. The next morning, we met Rourke in the back room of a rundown diner on the west side of Chicago. The place smelled of burnt coffee and stale grease, but it was quiet, and most importantly, discreet. Rourke spread a set of forged documents across the table. Badges, warrants, and official-looking paperwork stamped with government seals. "These will hold up under casual scrutiny," Rourke said, lighting a cigarette. "But if someone runs a deep check, you're done. So, make sure you don't give them a reason to dig." Elizabeth picked up one of the badges, turning it over in her hand. "And if Gray's people don't buy it?" Rourke exhaled a long trail of smoke. "Then you improvise." I glanced over the forged warrants. They looked real enough, But it wasn't the papers that would sell the act, it was how we carried ourselves. We had to look like we belonged. No hesitation, no doubt. "We'll need uniforms," I said. "Something that makes us look the part." Rourke nodded. "I know a guy. He'll get you what you need by this afternoon. But you only have one shot at this, so make it count." Elizabeth set the badge down and folded her arms. "What about our way in? We can't just walk through the front door." Rourke smirked. "You're not. There's a side entrance used for high-profile clients. Leads straight to the vault access corridors. Security is lighter there, but you'll still need to be quick. I'll set up the distraction. Get Gray's people looking the other way. Once you're in, you find the box, grab whatever's inside, and get out before anyone realizes the raid is fake." It sounded simple enough in theory, but we all knew nothing ever went according to plan. I exchanged a glance with Elizabeth. She was tense, but determined. "We do this right, and we might just get out of this alive," I said. Rourke crushed his cigarette in the ashtray. "Then you'd better get moving. Time's not on your side." As we left the diner, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were stepping into a trap of our own making. But at this point, there was no other way forward. The uniforms arrived in a plain brown package later that afternoon, courtesy of Rourke's contact. Standard federal issue, dark suits, stiff collars, and just enough authority to make someone think twice before asking questions. As I adjusted my badge under the lapel, I glanced at Elizabeth. She looked the part, but I could see the tension in her posture. "Nervous?" I asked, buttoning my jacket. Elizabeth exhaled sharply. "I don't like walking into situations blind. There's too much that can go wrong." She wasn't wrong. We had limited intel, a shaky plan, and only Rourke's word that Gray's people wouldn't sniff us out immediately. But it was all we had. "We stick to the script, and we keep our cool," I said. "We get in, get the box, and get out before anyone realizes what's happening." Rourke pulled up outside the Union Trust Bank in an unmarked sedan, his expression unreadable as we climbed into the back seat. "Everything's set. My guy inside will start the call in 5 minutes. That should give you just enough time to make it through security before the real trouble starts." Elizabeth adjusted her gloves, steeling herself. "And if Gray's men are already inside?" Rourke smirked. "Then you'd better be damn convincing." We stepped out onto the sidewalk, blending seamlessly into the early evening foot traffic. The bank loomed ahead, grand, imposing, and teeming with quiet menace. As we approached the side entrance, Elizabeth took a steadying breath and knocked twice. The security panel buzzed, and a voice came through the intercom. "Identification." I flashed my badge to the camera. "Agent Monroe, Bureau of Financial Crimes. We need immediate access to the vault." A tense pause. Then, the lock clicked open. We stepped inside, and the door shut behind us with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. We were in. Now came the hard part. The hallway leading to the vault was eerily silent, save for the hum of the security lights overhead. Elizabeth walked beside me, her movements precise, controlled. We had practiced this moment in our heads, but execution was another thing entirely. A guard sat at a desk outside the heavy steel door, his eyes flickering up at us as we approached. He was older, grizzled, the kind of man who had seen enough to be suspicious of anything out of place. "Identification," he said, his voice gravelly. I handed him my badge, keeping my expression neutral. "Agent Monroe, Bureau of Financial Crimes. This is Agent Lawson. We need access to safe deposit box 1198. The guard frowned, flipping through a clipboard before looking up at us again. Didn't get word about any federal visit today. Who authorized this? Elizabeth stepped forward, cool as ice. Your supervisor. Call them if you want to hold up a federal investigation. But I suggest you move fast. We don't have all night. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching for his phone. My pulse ticked up as I watched his fingers dial. If he called the wrong person, this entire operation would collapse before it even began. Yeah, this is Collins. Got 2 agents here from financial crimes saying they need vault access. You know anything about this? His voice was steady, but I caught the shift in his demeanor. He wasn't fully buying it. A long pause. Then, the person on the other end must have said something that made Collins relax. He grumbled under his breath, hung up the phone, and slid a keycard across the desk. Go ahead, but don't take too long. Elizabeth grabbed the keycard and wasted no time swiping it against the panel beside the vault door. A loud clunk echoed through the chamber as the heavy steel doors released. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of metal and paper. Rows of safe deposit boxes lined the walls, each one holding secrets that could ruin lives. We found box 1198 near the back. Elizabeth pulled the key from her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she fit it into the lock. With a turn, the door creaked open. Inside was a single envelope, thick with documents. No jewels, no cash, just pages of damning information. I reached for the envelope, but Elizabeth hesitated. This is it, she whispered. Whatever Wilkes was willing to die for. Before I could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the corridor. Someone was coming. Elizabeth's eyes met mine. We need to go. Now. The footsteps outside the vault grew louder. Whoever was coming wasn't wasting time. Elizabeth shoved the documents into her coat while I scanned the room for another way out. The vault had only one entrance, and that was currently a death trap. Elizabeth glanced at me, her voice hushed but urgent. We're cornered. I wasn't ready to give up just yet. Help me move this, I said, pointing at a row of metal filing cabinets against the wall. We heaved them aside, revealing a maintenance hatch barely large enough to squeeze through. A sharp knock echoed against the vault door. Open up, a voice commanded. No time left. I yanked the hatch open, motioning for Elizabeth to go first. She hesitated only a second before disappearing into the cramped passage. I followed, pulling the hatch shut behind us just as the vault door burst open. The tunnel was dark, musty, and barely wide enough for us to crawl through. I could hear voices shouting behind us, but we kept moving, ignoring the dirt and rust that clung to our clothes. The tunnel sloped downward before leading to a ladder. I went first, climbing down into a storage room filled with old banking equipment. Elizabeth landed beside me just as the pounding started above us. They had found the hatch. I scanned the room and spotted a service exit. There. We pushed through, emerging into a side alley. A black Hudson sedan idled near the curb. Rourke sat behind the wheel, his cigarette smoldering in his fingers as we stumbled toward him. Took you long enough, he muttered, opening the door. Get in. We barely had the doors shut before he hit the gas, the tires kicking up dust as we sped away. I twisted in my seat, watching as the bank side entrance filled with armed men. We had made it out. For now. Elizabeth clutched the documents like they were the last thing keeping her tethered to reality. It's all here, she murmured, flipping through the pages. Names, accounts, offshore transfers. This is more than enough to bring them down. Rourke's gaze flicked to me through the rearview mirror. You sure about that? Because if you're wrong, we just put the biggest target in the city on our backs. I took the file from Elizabeth, skimming through its contents. It was damning, evidence of bribery, fraud, and political manipulation that tied Gray and his employers to some of the most powerful figures in the country. This isn't just about money, I realized. This is about control. They weren't just hiding funds. They were buying people. Judges, law enforcement, politicians. Anyone who could be useful. Elizabeth nodded grimly. And now we have proof. Rourke took a sharp turn, heading toward the city's outskirts. You know they won't let this slide. You just kicked a hornet's nest, and these people don't forgive. I exhaled, the weight of what we had just done settling deep in my bones. Then we hit first. We take this straight to the Tribune. No back channels. No intermediaries. We give them everything. Elizabeth hesitated before nodding. There's a journalist, Henry Calloway. He's one of the few who isn't on their payroll. If we get this to him, he can break it wide open. Rourke smirked. Hope you like being famous. We drove through the night, the city lights casting long shadows against the windshield. When we reached Calloway's office, I stepped out first, gripping the file like a lifeline. A few knocks on the door, a tired voice answering from within. Moments later, we were sitting across from a man in a rumpled suit, his eyes widening as he flipped through the papers. This is bigger than anything I've ever seen, he whispered. You're sure about all of this? Wilkes died for it, I said. And if you don't move fast, we'll be next. Calloway didn't hesitate. He reached for his typewriter and started hammering out the biggest exposé of the decade. 3 days later, the morning edition of the Chicago Tribune ran the headline in bold ink. Political elite exposed in corruption scandal. Evidence reveals decades of bribery and fraud. It was done. Arrests were made, careers ended, and the city held its breath as the scandal unfolded. As for us, we disappeared. New names, new lives, but always looking over our shoulders. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running. I had won.